people have legitimately questioned the safety of these vaccines precisely because they did develop them so fast and they didn't have time, the normal time frame that you would use to test a drug, 5 years, 8 years, whatever, to really test it out and see long term. So my question becomes, at the same time, the drug companies got, basically, no liability. So how do we balance that? I mean, I'm troubled by a big, giant profit-making corporation creating something, profiting from everybody using it, and having no liability if that we find out there's something wrong. That's they're claiming we did it in the public good, but they don't appear to be giving it in the public good. They're making billions on it. So I'm asking you that directly, Joe. Is that a fair thing to say? Like, it's kind of like they're getting it, winning on both ends.
So I empathize enormously with that, because ultimately it is driving to the point that was made about generational wealth. We live in a society where intellectual property rights are so enormously valuable, where so much automation, so much specialized production adds so much value. But at the same time, we were in the midst, and still are, of a pandemic that was mushrooming out of control. And it was in large part the ability to rapidly deploy vaccines that at least led to some of the containment of it. There's no way that, well, it is less likely that that result would have come about had it not been for a couple of large players. The scale to which they had to produce new technology to be able to manufacture and distribute it safely. I mean, while I acknowledge that the long-term consequences of these vaccines may not be known, the near term has been dramatically.
Hang on, let him finish. Just let him finish, James. Go ahead. Say that again, Joe, while you acknowledge what?
Well, I acknowledge that there are some risks that we are all going to have to face, and it is contrary to basic notions of fairness that the manufacturer isn't going to have the liability associated with it. To me, you have to weigh that with the cost of having that vaccine present to vaccinate people when it did. And ultimately, my bigger issues related to access are not about their liability associated with the production of the product, but how are we going to distribute vaccines to everyone in the world who wants one, in part out of a sense of fairness, but in part also to establish global herd immunity for whatever next variant is going to come out of the continued COVID spread throughout the world.
Alex and James, one of the interesting things that I've noticed in this pandemic is that the typical framework, I mean, Big Pharma was kind of always like hated by the left. And now the left has kind of embraced it because of the politics, I think, that came from Trump and then to Biden and, the whole politicization of COVID. Yeah, in my mind, there is and it's good to have a healthy skepticism of any big industry. Like their goal is profit. I don't know how else to see it. Like their goal is not the well-being of us. That may be something they give us. Their goal is profit. I mean, the fact that they didn't, give the patents away on this, they're like, no, we're keeping it and no liability. I don't know. Again, my basic sense of fairness says something doesn't feel right. Like it's like they got too much. And I get Joe's point that they rushed to develop something and they took risks, but we took away all the risk for them and we're letting them keep all the benefit. I don't know. Is that just me? I mean, am I just, is my skepticism healthy or unhealthy? And I really want both, James, you and Alex, both to address that. Because, Alex, you've written a book on it, and James, you spend a lot of time looking at it.
Well, Alex made this point. You said we needed big companies to do this. Well, Johnson & Johnson was the only big company that succeeded in a vaccine. The Pfizer vaccine is the biotech vaccine. It's a company nobody had ever heard of before. It was a small company. Moderna, nobody had heard of Moderna 2 years ago. They didn't have a vaccine on the market. Novavax is their first product. All the successful products that have come about, including the Emory drug or the Oxford University vaccine, these have all been from universities or from very small companies that nobody had ever heard of before. So this is not a big pharma story. On the liability issue, I'm actually sympathetic to the companies. I mean, you ask them to rush them and have all these sort of expedited things. And I agree with Joe on that. If you ask them to rush them through and get them to people right away, you can't complain if they haven't got all the long-term safety stuff. I think that's just one thing you could ask is whether or not we've given too little attention to some of the older technologies, which are turning out to have sort of decent efficacy standards. Some of the protein vaccines, which have a better established longer-term safety record than some of the newer things, which are just novel technologies. But overall, I don't think the liability issue is the bigger problem.
Alex, you want to weigh in on that?
I might pick up on your point about quote unquote the left. I think it depends what you mean in terms of general attitudes by the left. I mean, if you're talking about the center, sort of liberal left, I mean, you look at something like MSNBC and it's all pharma ads. There's clearly a sort of stunted conversation within the Democratic Party, even though most Democrats support the positions of the more liberal members of the party on drug pricing and structural reforms. But it's a very stunted conversation, and hopefully will be broadened in the next year with some of these issues in the pandemic. In the context of the pandemic, it's an opportunity to tease these issues out and get them more, sort of out there and generally appreciated by the broader public, which generally has not been the case.